Thank you, Teresa, and good afternoon, everybody. My name's Roger Harris, and you heard the introduction earlier. I have a short talk today on Indigenous people, sustainability, and tourism. So I have a few slides to share, which I can now put up. Share the screen. So is my slide visible?
Yes.
Good. So there's my title, Indigenous People. I'm going to talk about tourism and sustainability. So to start, according to the World Bank, there are around 476 million Indigenous people worldwide living in more than 90 countries, and something like 75% of those in Asia. So Indigenous peoples own, occupy, or use a quarter of the world's surface, and they safeguard 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. Although comprising little more than 6% of the global population, they account for about 15% of the world's extreme poor. Now, unorthodox development schemes often fail to address the marginalization of Indigenous peoples, so new approaches are required. So I want to talk about information and communication technologies, because over the last 25 years, I've been working with rural, remote, and isolated Indigenous communities in Borneo to introduce them to communication technologies such as computers and the internet, and to help them devise and implement development projects of their own choosing. This has resulted in many education, social communications, agriculture, enterprise development, and cultural preservation. However, one of the most significant of these benefits has been the growth of community-based tourism. And this has grown from virtually nothing in the mountains in the interior of Borneo, where I work, to becoming a mainstay of the local economies, delivering many types of tourism to almost every household in the community. And the internet has played a vital role in this by connecting residents directly to potential visitors for marketing and information sharing by mainstream operators of the global tourism industry. It is run by the communities themselves, either as a full-time business or as an adjunct to their agricultural-based livelihoods. So being able to communicate directly with travelers cuts out middlemen agents and means that a greater proportion of revenues is retained by the community. So community-based tourism has been burgeoning across Asia, other parts of the developing world as well, often driven by aid agencies, governments, and individual communities with the purpose of creating employment, generating incomes, and reviving their economies. It's of special interest to Indigenous peoples and other ethnic minorities, who are often the poorest people in the countries where they live, but who feature regularly and prominently in the promotional material of the tourism industry. However, these people invariably fail to share equally in the profits that are generated by the tourists who are attracted to their homelands. So community-based tourism puts the control of tourism in the hands of the residents of popular tourism locations, and it secures a fairer share of the profits for them. It provides unique and authentic experiences for the culturally sensitive traveler who is eager to learn about new cultures from close encounters with them and to witness the sustainable lifestyles that are often lived by many Indigenous communities. So turning now to sustainable development, and we can notice that the reasoning behind the global sustainable development goals is that development cannot be sustainable if it fails to protect the environment, and that the environment cannot be protected if development is not sustainable. I think this was well exemplified in Dr. Annel's previous presentation. And indigenous peoples have understood this for countless generations, yet unsustainable development continues to warm the planet's climate, and the greatest impact is being felt in the regions that are inhabited by indigenous communities. That's to say the rainforests, the Arctic, low-lying coastal areas and islands, and of course the mountain glacial regions that we just heard about from Dr. Annel. At the same time, however, there's a growing realization that indigenous peoples have been the stewards of these regions for millennia, and they are the best equipped to maintain the biodiversity that these places hold. Their traditional knowledge has much to offer to modern science in understanding both the impacts of climate change as well as the means of adapting to them. Accordingly, the currently accepted paradigm for sustainable development science is that it requires involving non-scientists. The global discourse on sustainable development is therefore shifting towards a greater acknowledgement of the role of indigenous peoples and local communities and their traditional territories in biodiversity conservation and climate change resilience. In Borneo, it is acknowledged that indigenous communities can maintain their roles as stewards of the environment as long as they are allowed to maintain their traditional lifestyles. And this is where the technology comes in, excuse me, because information and communication technologies reinforce the ability of indigenous communities to retain the essence of their traditional lifestyles within the context of 21st century developments. So by building upon the innate hospitality of such communities, community-based tourism incentivizes environmental and cultural protection at the same time as generating much needed revenues. Through community-based tourism, more tourists are exposed to sustainable lifestyles and are able to better understand the environmental stewardship role that is played by the indigenous communities, as well as appreciating the natural beauty of their threatened surroundings. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted our dysfunctional relationship with nature. Some of the observers hope that the pandemic will instigate action to address ecosystem degradation and biodiversity loss. Indigenous peoples offer untapped potential for understanding how we are shaping resilient solutions to COVID-19 and similar threats into the future. It is estimated that half of the world's GDP is highly or moderately dependent on nature. A focus on nature can help us understand where pandemics come from and how the socio-economic fallout from the crisis could be mitigated. Therefore, ensuring the collective rights of indigenous peoples to lands, territories, and resources, as well as empowering them to maintain their traditions, is not only good for their well-being, but is also good for addressing climate change and environmental degradation. So my last slide, I want to address the concept of virtual tourism, which has several meanings. I'm not going to expand on all of them, but just to say that the COVID-19 pandemic has upended the travel and tourism industries, as we've heard. Just to remind you, global tourist arrivals are down by almost 90%, putting more than 41 million jobs at risk. International passenger air traffic has all but disappeared. In the absence of travelers, some industry players are turning to technology to keep would-be visitors interested and to prepare for the long road back to recovery. So virtual tourism, which began as a temporary stopgap measure, may now become a long-term tool in today's world as shaped by the COVID-19 pandemic. Virtual tourism uses technology to allow would-be tourists to visit real places without leaving home, to explore new areas and plan real trips, and to visit areas that are inaccessible. This slide, by the way, is a 3D picture of the Himalayas, the Everest region, and it accompanies an individual who's currently climbing up there and sending out his location and images in real time as he's doing it. So in the virtual sense, you can join him climbing in these mountains. So it's therefore a natural extension to what I call ECBT, or electronic community-based tourism. And Indigenous communities that are equipped with suitable technology and capability can now generate revenues by selling tailored, personalized, and interactive virtual tours online. The other picture at the bottom there is a friend of mine who's a tour guide, a very active tourism operator in the mountains in central Borneo, and he takes his camera everywhere, and wherever he goes, hiking the trails and up and down the streams and the rivers and the waterfalls in central Borneo, all of which goes out online and live. So to conclude, the pandemic presents a threat as well as an opportunity. The opportunity for the world's most marginalized communities, that's to say Indigenous peoples, arises from a combination of poverty alleviation through virtual and personalized community-based tourism, together with greater popularization of their vital role as guardians of the planet's most critical environments and stores of biodiversity. That's the end of my presentation. I'd be delighted to take any questions. Thank you very much.
We have covered this content, but I wanted to talk to you about the agenda of environment, sustainability, and the current impact of pandemic. You did mention that working with communities will help us identify where the pandemic is going, but let's talk about current situation and how not having tourism is affecting the communities. Can you throw a little bit light on that? And also, since sustainability is the primary agenda, how can we bring back sustainability to the table again through community tourism?
Okay, thanks, Teresa, for your question. Well, the pandemic actually has accelerated demand for rural and nature-based tourism. People seeking to recover, psychologically and physically from all the problems, the restrictions, and the lockdowns. So where they're still able to operate, rural tourism operators are still in business, and they're depending on domestic visitors. Now, in my part of the world, for instance, China is in the middle of a boom in rural tourism. It's been one of the largest domestic tourism markets in the world, and so other Southeast Asian countries are also trying to promote domestic tourism, waiting until international tourists return. Like the government of Vietnam has launched Vietnamese People Travel in Vietnam campaign. But when you visit China, which I have done several times, and you go to rural areas, the type of tourism that you mostly see caters for the mass market. It's not community-based tourism. And you end up with the situation like Dr. Anil described in Uttarakhand. So there are pristine rural tourism destinations in China, receiving dozens of coachloads of tourists every year, and they're herded through pristine areas, very carefully controlled, I must say, in order to protect the environment. And the communities are really overrun by outside businesses that come in and set up all kinds of business activities. And that's not really the kind of tourism that I'm trying to promote, either in a real physical sense or a real sense, because it's not that friendly to the environment. And the slippery slope on that type of tourism is the next thing that happens is a glitzy hotel opens up, and then it's a golf course, and then it's a casino, and the local attractions are completely subsumed by the artificiality of this type of tourism. So there's a very fine line to be drawn and a balance to be upheld. But where tourist operators work in conjunction with local communities rather than trying to take over their local assets, I think fruitful results can emerge. And a lot has to do with limiting access. Mr. Kam mentioned about over-tourism. There are many, many other places around the world that are suffering these kind of problems. And the only answer has to be, you have to reduce access. And in one way, reducing the access increases the attraction, because it suddenly becomes if you like, a desirable or an elitist place to go. Where I work in Borneo, access is limited through the physicality or the limitation of the travel infrastructure. But there are pressures to overcome that. And of course, once that happens, access becomes easier. And then you start the process of the beginnings of over-tourism take place. So I think limiting access, working with communities, and in order to achieve that, I would say highlighting these issues to national tourism authorities, which are often not that interested in small-scale local activities. Their job is really seen to increase the occupancy of big hotel chains. But if and not in all cases, I must say, probably Nepal being one of the exceptions, but working with getting national tourism authorities to work with local communities and partners, technology partners, to promote this kind of widespread, small-scale, low-impact, high-value tourism, where the community and the environment take first place in any considerations and any decision-making that takes place.
Can you make clear how can we make impressive virtual tourism in Nepal? What types of program will be possible?
Well, I would say when I first introduced or tried to introduce the internet to a remote community in the middle of Borneo, it was seen as a wild idea. And I'm getting the same feeling talking about virtual tourism in the way that I envisage it, as a personalized, interactive, self-curated, tailored experience. So my answer is, how do we make it reality? My answer then was, well, one community at a time. And I think that's the way to approach a concept like this. But by getting at least one good, solid demonstrator that really encapsulates all the benefits that you're trying to capture. So to do that, you need a receptive community. And I think that I've visited many all across Nepal. Everywhere I've gone, people are receptive to new ideas and they're anxious to look very seriously at anything that can improve their situation. But secondly, you need partners, a range of partners from all sectors, business, environmental, NGOs. You need politicians on board, and you need government officials. But I think more especially, coming back to some of the comments that we heard right at the beginning of this session, of this event, bring in youths, bring in the youngsters who have got the energy and the vision to create something new, to make it work for them and their communities, and also youngsters who have the technology skills, who can handle what's needed to make such events happen. I mean, what we're doing now is in a way as an example of virtual tourism. It's a particular type of tourism, but it's virtual and it's working well. Now, I'm well past the age where I'm comfortable with the technology. So you need youngsters, you need young people straight out of university to get out into the field, take their technology skills with them, engage with communities, recruit partners, identify opportunities, and just make it happen, and then go out and shout about it, tell everybody, and they will start knocking at their doors. Teresa?